Well, my name is Demetrius Titus. I did 18 years of incarceration on a sentence of 3 natural lives and a 10 to 20, which sentence was actually stacked. Where to begin? I guess my story would kind of begin on a perpetual way of thinking that was in my family. This way of thinking was passed down from one generation to the next generation. It was just the norm. My grandfather was in and out of prison until the point where he caught a life bit but he was released because he ended up with cancer and died soon after. That same way of thinking was translated to my father, but my father missed the introduction into prison because of the draft. However, coming back from Vietnam, from what I had understood, he was just not the same person, and he came back with a habit, a very serious drug habit. So my life was one that it was just a norm in our family to hustle. My grandfather was a hustler, my father was a hustler, and so it was just the norm. My mother did the best that she could, and because she did do the best that she could, I at least made the effort, I would say, to do that, which was right. However, at 17, my mother died of cancer. That's when my life began to spiral out of control. I went back to what I thought I knew best. I went back to the same way of thinking that my grandfather had and my father had, and I took to the streets. Although I started off and I graduated from high school and at 17 and I was in college, it seemed like after the loss of my mother, I just kind of lost my way. At that time, I really had no direction. I had no understanding of the consequences of my actions. And so I got caught deep into the street life. I got caught deep into the game. Which led to me getting caught. It was a federal investigation that was done, so I was arrested on a federal level. But because I would not participate with what the feds wanted out of me, they turned it over to state. State instantly told me that, hey, if you don't participate with us, we're going to give you natural life, and this was for drug charges. I said, hey, I made my bed, I guess I got to sleep in it. So I went to court. Of course, I lost. However, I had a sympathetic judge out of Oakland County in Michigan, and I can never forget the judge. Judge name was Barry Howard, and I remember standing in front of him, and I remember saying, this man who stands before me is 21, 22 years old at the time, and he says, I refused to follow the mandate of these laws. At the time, the laws mandated that a certain period of time you would be sentenced to, regardless if you had no priors, regardless of whatever. It was just a mandate that was established on the drug on war initiatives that started back in the late 60s, early 70s, and he refused to sentence me to natural life. So I was sentenced to a 13-year term. However, the prosecution wasn't satisfied with that. So when I went to prison, I was doing pretty decent time. I was doing pretty good time, and it was a big transition for me. But I think my turning point was when the prosecution appealed his decision. I was brought back. They put my case in front of a visiting drug judge who had no idea or no concept of my case and the reasoning behind Judge Howard's decision, and I was sentenced to 3 natural lives and a 10 to 20. So for the most part, I would have to say that during that time, that was my turning point. While I was in prison, I wasn't really ready to accept that sentence. And when you're in a very volatile environment, an environment that perpetuates anger, you have to find a center. You have to find your own space where you can find your peace. So what I did is I engaged myself in my religion, and as well as focused on educating myself. Because I did have some education, I was always allotted the jobs as clerks for the law library and clerks for classification and all these other different positions that most people in prison kind of inspire for. And so I got my first taste of the law working in the law library, and I began to really just engulf myself into understanding law, understanding Michigan law, and I began to educate myself, and I use that as my platform and to lift myself out of the conditions and the environment that breeded so much hate. You know, I think about some of the times that I had, one time in particular where I was extremely sick to the point of death. I didn't think that I was going to get out of prison. I remember that there was an internal infection that took place, and I remember dealing with health care, and they were just, hey, take an aspirin and go lay down, you'll be better. It'll be all right. But I was literally dying, and it was just the compassion of an officer who saw me and seeing that there was something drastically wrong with me, and they went to the ward, and it was like, something's the matter with this guy, and the warden even dispelled it. And why are you so concerned with this individual? What is something going on with you and him? And you know, she broke protocol and reached out to my family, and my family began to call down to Lansing, and they began to call around until it forced their hands. And I remember that I was being rushed to the hospital and being handcuffed to a bed, and I can vividly remember the doctor walking in and says, you know, you would have been dead in a day. Mm. You know, when I reflect back on it, it's something, because I never really said it out loud too often about this story. And when I think back on it, I think back on everything that people has to endure while incarcerated. And I think this is what drives me for working for AFSC, because of the experience that I had. And I know that when those who are incarcerated and dealing with the conditions of their confinement, I understand. I don't sympathize, I empathize. Because I know what it's like to be in a place where you're demoralized, and I know what it's like to be in a place where you're not considered a human being, and just finding your place where you can actually rise above it. So what had happened is, in 2007, as I was in Cotton facility, I was sitting on a bunk, and Governor Granholm was doing her state-to-state address, and at the time I recalled that Michigan Department of Correction was busting at the seams at over 56,000. I can remember during this time that the day rooms, or our rec rooms, we refer to them as day rooms, I can remember there were people who were actually sleeping in the day rooms because we were just so overcrowded. And I remember they were looking for a way to kind of bring some kind of relief to the system. And when she was talking and she was saying that she was going to take an aggressive approach towards trying to alleviate the strain that was currently in Michigan Department of Corrections, immediately I sat and I said, well, maybe this might be my opportunity. Because I had the opportunity to educate myself, and I was working in the law library, I quickly sat down and I was able to draft my own commutation. I was able to send that commutation in, and the parole board seeing that there was merit, and the governor's office seeing that there was merit, and I ended up receiving a parole. But the thing is about parole, being on parole, It's still incarceration in a sense, but it's more along in a sense that although you have physical freedom, you still have to walk a very thin line to maintain that freedom. I was in a very difficult relationship, which most individuals get into when they get out, because of dealing with loneliness and heartache, and you grab hold to the first thing you see. I was in a very difficult relationship, and the relationship did not work out, and I found myself back in the county jail again. Now, to understand my situation, if I were to have been violated, I would have had to go back into prison and spend the rest of my life incarcerated. However, my parole officer did an investigation and seen that all the accusations against me was false, that there was no merit behind them, and I was released. From that point, I just began to work. I started off working outside in the wintertime, part-time in a recycling plant. Minimum wage, and that just wasn't making it. I kept pushing, I kept driving, I kept pushing. I ended up working in a factory as a janitor. I kept pushing, I kept working, and I met my now wife, and having a support system, having people who believe in you, having people who are ready to go to bat for you, for me personally, was the turning point in my release. She believed in me, and she says, hey, you're smart, you're intelligent, you have an education, go for it. Stop doubting yourself. I think that was the biggest issue I had. I continually doubted myself, and to this day, I still sometimes battle with it. Because of the traumatic experience of prison, I still battle with sometimes having self-doubt and confliction within myself about if I'm actually able to live up to what society says is success. But she believed in me, and she believed in me enough that I began to believe in myself. So I started working in hospitalities. I worked there for 3 or 4 years, and I made my way up to becoming an actual account manager, and I continued to drive forward, and I ended up becoming a night manager, an assistant GM of a multi-million-dollar hotel. I can't say that it was an easy route. I won't say it was an easy route because it seemed like it was resistance every step of the way. But the one thing I've noticed about resistance is it only made me stronger. It only made me more durable. And while I was working there, my wife, she works as a headhunter for IBM, and she happened to see the posting for the job of the American Friends Service Committee, and she was like, honey, this is you. This epitomizes what you've gone through and what you are and who you are as a person. And so I went for it, and I was blessed by Natalie Hallbrook, who's the director, to give me that opportunity. But it was a bittersweet for me because for the duration of the period of time that I was incarcerated, I guess I carried a lot of baggage that I didn't realize. And what happened is I struggled when I first came home with nightmares of being back in prison. I struggled, and I woke up in cold sweats about being behind those bars again. And I fought for this for a long time. I didn't realize how deeply traumatic that experience was for me, and how integrated it was into my very soul. And it was funny because when I was able to finally overcome it and getting an opportunity to work for the American Friends Service Committee, and being able to go back into the prisons to tell my story, and being able to go back into prison and do parole readiness workshops to help to guys to get direction in life, the nightmares begin to happen again. I begin to be revisited by the same trauma that I thought that I had overcome. Granted, it was difficult to say the least. But now, being able to see the direct effect that it's having on individuals who are incarcerated, who are coming out, I can actually say it's worth it. If being able to deal with sacrificing a small portion of my peace of mind to see that someone else is able to get a complete peace of mind, it's well worth it. But I can definitely say that the experience of being incarcerated made me who I am today. I will always fight for what I know is right. When I look in my 2-year-old son's eyes, there's nothing I won't face. There's nothing I won't do. There's no conflict that I don't think is too big for me to pave the way for him to not have to experience what my father and my father's father and I experienced. So I believe what motivates me is when I'm able to look into my son's face and then I'm able to say, you know, whatever I need to do, son, I'm going to do to secure your future. So I guess my passion now, today, I would say is this work. Educating the communities and speaking to individuals on one-on-one basis and talking about the injustices of the system and how flawed it is and what work we must do in order to facilitate change. It is my passion. It's become my life. And I honestly can say that I am at a place where I find great joy in doing what I do.